18 years old and standing in front of a county council she had never seen before in a courthouse she had entered for the first time that morning, facing a man in a charcoal suit who was telling everyone in the room that she did not belong. The man's name was Colton Harmon. He was 55 years old with silver hair swept back from a tanned forehead and teeth so white they looked like they had been installed rather than grown. He stood at a podium with a stack of documents in front of him and a lawyer on each side, and he spoke with the easy confidence of someone who had never lost anything he wanted to keep. "This girl," he said, gesturing toward Wren without looking at her, "is 18 years old. She has no family, no permanent address, no legal representation. She purchased a condemned property for $10 at a tax sale and has been living there illegally for 6 months, operating an unlicensed food processing facility and refusing reasonable offers to vacate." He paused and let his gaze sweep across the 7 council members seated behind the raised bench. "She is not a landowner," he said. "She is a squatter. And she is standing in the way of a development project that will bring jobs and tourism to this entire valley." Wren stood at the other podium, the one without lawyers, the one without documents, the one that felt like it was made of paper and might collapse if she leaned on it too hard. She was small. She had always been small. At 12, she looked 9. At 15, she looked 12. At 18, she still got carded at movies rated for teenagers, which would have been funny if anything else in her life had been funny. Her hands were shaking. She could feel the tremor running from her fingertips up through her wrists and into her forearms, a vibration she could not control. No matter how hard she pressed her palms against the wooden surface in front of her. But she did not step back. She did not look away. And when the council chairman asked if she had anything to say in response, she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a piece of paper that was older than she was. It was brittle at the edges. The pencil marks had faded to a pale gray that was hard to read in certain lights. It had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had become soft as cloth. She unfolded it one more time and looked at the words written there by a man who had died 60 years before she was born. Then she began to speak. But this is not where the story starts. The story starts 6 months earlier in a house on the north side of Asheville, North Carolina, on a Thursday afternoon in February when the temperature was 34 degrees and the sky was the color of wet cement, and a girl named Wren Calloway came home from school to find everything she owned in a black garbage bag on the front porch. Wren had lived in that house for 11 years. She had moved there when she was 7, after her mother Shelby married a man named Lyle, who installed gutters for a living and drank bourbon for a hobby. The house belonged to Lyle. Everything in it belonged to Lyle, including in some way that was never spoken aloud but always understood Shelby and Wren themselves. Lyle was not a complicated man. He had a narrow face and thick hands, and a voice that carried through walls whether he wanted it to or not. When he was sober, he was quiet and distant, moving through the house like a boarder who happened to share their last name. When he was drunk, he was loud and mean and full of opinions about everything Wren did wrong, which was everything. She breathed wrong. She walked wrong. She looked at him wrong. She existed wrong. Every night was a catalog of her failures delivered in a voice that started low and rose steadily until it filled every room in the house like water filling a basement. He never hit her. That was the thing Wren told herself when she was trying to make sense of it, trying to measure it against some standard that would tell her whether what was happening was bad enough to matter. He never hit her. He never hit Shelby either. He just talked. He just yelled. He just filled the house with noise that pushed against her eardrums and pressed against her chest and made it hard to breathe, even when she was standing in an empty room with all the windows open. The bruises he left were not on her skin. They were somewhere deeper, somewhere she could not see or touch or show to anyone who might have been able to help. Shelby had married Lyle because she was alone and tired and had a daughter to raise and no money to do it with. She had been 29 years old, working as a receptionist at a veterinary clinic, dreaming of going back to school to become a vet herself someday when things settled down, when life got easier, when Wren was older and needed less. But things never settled down. Life never got easier, and Wren grew older but needed more, not less, as children always do. So Shelby married a man who owned a house and had a steady job and who seemed in those first months like someone who could be counted on. And by the time she realized her mistake, it was too late. She was in too deep. The house was in his name. The money was in his account. The life she had built was balanced on a foundation she did not control. So she learned to be invisible. Wren watched her mother disappear by inches over the years that followed. The woman who had once sung while she cooked dinner and laughed at jokes on television and read bedtime stories with different voices for every character slowly faded into someone who moved through rooms without making sound, who answered questions in single words, who looked at Lyle when he entered and looked away when he raised his voice, and never, ever looked at Wren when Lyle was watching. Because looking at Wren meant acknowledging that Wren was there. And acknowledging that Wren was there meant acknowledging that Wren was hearing everything, seeing everything, absorbing everything that happened in that house into a part of herself that would never be clean again. Shelby could not face that, so she looked away. And Wren learned to be invisible too. It happened the way children learn everything through observation and imitation and endless practice until the performance becomes indistinguishable from the truth. She learned to eat quietly, cutting her food into small pieces and chewing with her mouth closed and never letting her fork scrape against the plate. She learned to walk without making the floorboards creak, stepping close to the walls where the wood was firmer, distributing her weight across the balls of her feet like a dancer or a thief. She learned to sit in her room with the door closed and the lights off, reading by the glow of the street lamp outside her window, holding the book close to her face so that no one passing in the hallway would know she was awake. She became so good at being invisible that sometimes she wondered if she existed at all. The only place Wren felt real was the bakery. She found the job the summer she turned 16, answering a handwritten sign in the window of a shop called Honey and Rye on a side street downtown. The owner was a woman named Mabel, who was 62 years old with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and arms like a longshoreman from 4 decades of kneading dough by hand. Mabel called everyone Sugar. She called the mailman Sugar. She called the health inspector Sugar. She called the teenager who showed up at her back door at 5 in the morning looking for work Sugar. And then she handed that teenager an apron and a broom and told her to start sweeping. The hours were brutal. 4:30 in the morning to 7 before school started, sweeping floors and washing pans and loading fresh loaves into the display cases. The pay was $9 an hour in cash, handed over at the end of each shift in a small envelope with no taxes taken out and no questions asked. Mabel never asked why a 16-year-old was willing to wake up at 4 in the morning. She never asked why Wren always arrived with her backpack, why she never talked about her family, why she flinched at loud noises and kept her eyes on the floor when men walked into the shop. She just handed Wren a broom and let her sweep, and Wren swept. She swept the wide plank floors until they shone. She swept the sidewalk out front and the alley out back. She swept the crumbs from the display cases and the flour from the work tables and the dust from the corners where it gathered in soft gray drifts. Sweeping was the first thing Wren had ever been good at. It required no talent, no creativity, no special knowledge. It just required showing up and doing the work and not stopping until the floor was clean. And when she finished and looked back at the space she had cleared, she felt something she rarely felt anywhere else. She felt useful. She felt competent. She felt like she had taken a small piece of the world and made it better than it was before. It was not much, but it was hers. Wren saved every dollar she earned. She kept the money in a plastic bag inside a sock inside her backpack, which she took everywhere, including the bathroom, including the shower. The backpack was her escape hatch, her emergency kit, her proof that if everything fell apart, she would not be completely helpless. By February of her senior year, she had saved $214. It was not enough to rent an apartment. It was not enough to buy a car. It was barely enough to survive for a month if she slept outdoors and ate nothing but bread. But it was something. And on that Thursday in February, when she came home from school and found the garbage bag on the porch, she discovered that something was better than nothing. The garbage bag was black and shiny and stuffed so full that the plastic stretched tight across whatever was inside. Wren stood on the porch and looked at it for a long time. She could hear the television through the wall, a game show with applause and buzzers, and a host's voice saying something cheerful about prizes. She could see Lyle's truck in the driveway, the same truck that was always there, parked in the same spot as always. She tried the front door. It was locked. She knocked. No one answered. She knocked again, harder. Still nothing. She stood there for 3 minutes, maybe 4, feeling the cold February air seep through her jacket and into her bones. The game show audience applauded again. A car drove past on the street behind her. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. Then she picked up the garbage bag and walked away. She did not cry. Wren Calloway did not cry. She had learned early that crying drew attention, and attention in that house was never a good thing. So she had trained herself not to cry the way athletes train themselves not to flinch through repetition and discipline and the slow accumulation of scar tissue over everything soft inside her. She walked to the bus stop at the corner and waited for the number 12, which ran downtown every 20 minutes. She sat in the back of the bus with the garbage bag at her feet and her backpack on her lap and her eyes fixed on the window, watching the neighborhood slide past like scenes from a movie about someone else's life. It was 4:30 in the afternoon when she arrived at Honey and Rye. The shop was closed for the day, the display cases empty, the ovens cooling, but the lights were still on in the back, and Wren could see Mabel through the window, wiping down the counters the way she did every evening before she went home. Wren stood outside for a moment, not sure what she was going to say. Not sure she had the right to ask for anything. Then Mabel looked up and saw her through the glass. Their eyes met. Mabel looked at Wren's face. She looked at the garbage bag. She looked at the backpack clutched against Wren's chest like a shield. She walked to the door and unlocked it and pulled it open. "Sit down, sugar," she said. "I will make you some toast." The toast was thick sliced sourdough with butter and raspberry jam. The same bread Wren loaded into the display cases every morning. The same jam Mabel made herself from berries she bought at the farmer's market in August. Wren sat at the small table in the back of the bakery, the one where Mabel ate her lunch and did her books. And she ate the toast slowly, one small bite at a time, while Mabel made phone calls in the other room. Wren could hear pieces of the conversation through the wall, bits of words, fragments of sentences, names she did not recognize. But mostly she just sat and ate and breathed and let the warmth of the bakery sink into the cold places inside her. When she finished the toast, Mabel came back and sat down across from her. "I have something for you," Mabel said. if you want it. She explained. Her cousin Jasper owned a property up in Madison County past Hot Springs way back in the mountains. It was an old grist mill on a creek, a stone building 2 stories tall, built in 1871 by a man who cut the stones himself from the creek bed. It had been empty since 1962 when the last owner died. The county had tried to demolish it twice, but both times the contractors said it was not worth bringing equipment up the creek trail, so it was still standing. The county put it up for tax sale last year, Mabel said. Nobody bid. The asking price was $10. $10, Wren said. $10, Mabel repeated. It is 2 miles from the nearest road. There is no electric, no water except the creek, no cell service. The roof is bad. The floor might not be safe. It is the kind of place where a person could disappear and nobody would ever find them. She paused and looked at Wren with eyes that had seen 62 years of people walking through hard times and coming out the other side. That might be what you need right now, she said. A place where nobody can find you. A place where nobody will bother you. Nobody will bother you. Those 4 words landed in Wren's chest like a key turning in a lock she had not known was there. She had spent her entire life being bothered, being watched, being judged, being made smaller by someone else's anger and fear and need for control. The idea of a place where no one would yell at her, no one would criticize her, no one would fill the air with noise that made it hard to think. That idea was worth more than $10. It was worth everything she had. Yes, she said, I want it. Mabel drove her to the Madison County Courthouse the next morning in a bakery delivery van that smelled like sourdough starter and diesel fuel. The courthouse was a handsome brick building in Marshall, the county seat, a small town squeezed between the French Broad River and the mountains that rose straight up on both sides like walls built by giants. The clerk's office was on the 2nd floor. The clerk was a thin man in his 50s with a gray mustache and a bolo tie who looked at the property listing, then at Wren, then at Mabel, then back at the listing. The old Whitmore Mill on Laurel Creek, he said. That is the one. Mabel nodded. The man leaned back in his chair and rubbed his chin. Miss, he said that property is 2 miles from the nearest maintained road. The last mile is a footpath. There is no electric within a 1/4 mile, no cell service. The building has not been occupied since Ezra Whitmore died in 1962. The roof is compromised. The floor may not be safe. He adjusted his bolo tie. The county tried to demolish it in 2008 and again in 2015. Both times the contractor said it was not worth bringing equipment up the creek trail, so it is still standing. Barely. Wren put a $10 bill on the counter. The clerk looked at the bill. He looked at Wren. He picked up a pen. You will need to sign here, he said, and here. Mabel drove Wren as far as the road went, which was a gravel Forest Service road that ended at a turnaround beside a trailhead sign. From there, it was a 2-mile walk along Laurel Creek. Mabel hugged her at the truck, pressing a paper bag of bread and cheese into her hands and looking at her with an expression that was equal parts pride and worry. You call me if you need anything, Mabel said. There is a payphone at the gas station in Hot Springs. Wren nodded and turned toward the trail. She walked for 45 minutes. The path followed the creek upstream, winding through a forest of tulip poplars and hemlocks and rhododendron thickets, so dense they formed tunnels of green. The creek ran fast and clear over a bed of smooth stones, making a sound like voices murmuring in another room, constant and wordless and strangely comforting. The air was cold and damp and smelled like wet stone and decaying leaves and the clean mineral scent of moving water. Ferns grew in thick beds along the banks, their fronds still brown and curled from winter, waiting for spring to unfurl them. The trail was narrow but well-worn packed earth with exposed roots and rocks polished smooth by decades of rainfall and footsteps. Wren passed a waterfall small but beautiful, the water dropping 6 feet over a ledge of dark rock into a pool so clear she could count the pebbles on the bottom. She passed a stand of birch trees with white bark peeling in curls like old paint. She passed a pile of stones that might have been a chimney once 100 years ago from a house that no longer existed. She was used to being alone. She had been alone in crowded rooms for years, but this was different. This was the first time being alone felt like something she had chosen rather than something that had been done to her. The forest did not watch her the way people watched her. It did not judge her or evaluate her or decide what she was worth based on how much noise she made or how much space she took up. It just existed, vast and indifferent and alive, and she existed inside it, and that was enough. Then around a bend where the creek made a sharp turn, around a rock outcropping, she saw it. The mill house sat directly over the creek, straddling it like a bridge made of stone. It was built of rough-cut gray stone, fitted together without mortar, in the old Appalachian style, each block chosen and placed by hand to lock against its neighbors. Green and yellow lichen covered the stones in patches, and moss grew thick in the cracks where moisture collected. The building was 2 stories tall, maybe 25 feet wide and 35 feet long. The lower story was the mill room, where the grinding stones would have been its walls, rising directly from the creek bed, the water flowing through a stone archway beneath the building with a soft rushing sound that never stopped. The upper story was the living quarters with 2 windows on each side, the glass long gone, leaving dark rectangles that looked like eyes watching the forest. On the creek side, the old wooden water wheel was still partially attached to the building, but it was broken. 3 of its paddles were missing. The wooden axle was cracked. The whole structure listed to one side, covered in thick green moss that made it look like something that had grown rather than been built. The front door faced the trail, a heavy oak door that hung crooked on rusted iron hinges resting at an angle against the stone frame like a drunk leaning against a wall. The roof was wooden shingles, and roughly a quarter of them were missing on the left side, exposing the dark rafters beneath. Ivy and Virginia creeper covered the right wall from foundation to roofline, green and brown and tangled like something from a fairy tale. But the walls were straight, the corners were plumb, the foundation was bedrock. This building had been standing for over 150 years. It looked like it could stand for 150 more if someone cared enough to give it a roof. Wren pushed past the crooked door and stepped inside. The ground floor was the mill room, a single large space with a stone floor and a low ceiling of heavy oak beams. The grinding stones were still there, 2 circular discs of granite about 3 feet across, mounted one on top of the other, in a wooden frame at the center of the room. They were covered in dust and cobwebs, but intact, waiting for someone to set them spinning again. The mechanism that had once connected them to the water wheel, a system of wooden gears and iron shafts, had partially collapsed against the back wall. But the bones were there. The structure was there. It could be rebuilt. The creek was audible everywhere, a constant murmur coming up through the stone floor and through the archway at the rear of the room where the water flowed beneath the building. It was the sound of the mill's heartbeat, slow and steady and patient, still beating after 60 years of silence. A narrow wooden staircase in the corner led up to the second floor. Wren tested each step before putting her full weight on it. The wood creaked and flexed but held. The second floor was a single room with wide plank floors, stone walls, and 2 windows on each side that let in pale green light filtered through the forest canopy. A stone fireplace stood against the back wall, its chimney running up through the damaged roof. An old iron bed frame sat in one corner, the mattress long gone. A wooden table and one chair stood against the opposite wall, both dusty but solid. The floor was made of wide chestnut planks, dark with age, and when Wren stepped on them, she noticed something immediately. Several of the planks near the fireplace were loose. They rocked slightly under her weight, a subtle movement that most people would have missed. But Wren was not most people. She had spent her whole life noticing things other people missed. Shifts in tone, changes in breathing, the difference between a door that was locked and a door that was about to be locked. Noticing was how she survived. She knelt beside the loose planks and pressed on them with her palm. They lifted easily, as if they had been designed to be lifted, as if someone had deliberately made them removable. Beneath the planks in the cavity between the floor and the ceiling of the mill room below was a wooden crate. It was handmade rough sawn, about the size of a milk crate with rope handles on the sides. It was heavier than it looked when Wren pulled it out and set it on the floor beside her. Inside the crate, wrapped in heavy canvas that had been waxed to keep out moisture, were mason jars. 12 of them packed tight, their zinc lids dull with age but still sealed. The glass caught the pale green light from the windows and held it. And when Wren looked closer, she saw that the jars were filled with something. She opened the first jar. Coins. Old coins. Large silver dollars and half dollars, heavy and cool in her hand, stacked tight inside the glass. She had never seen so many coins in one place. She had never held this much money in her hands. She opened the second jar. Paper money. Old bills rolled tight and packed so densely the jar weighed several pounds. The bills were brown with age but intact, protected by the airtight seal and the waxed canvas. She opened the third jar. More coins. The fourth. Bills. The fifth. A mixture of both. She opened every jar, sitting on the chestnut floor with the forest light coming through the glassless windows and the sound of the creek rising through the stones beneath her. Her hands were shaking again, but not with fear this time. The paper money totaled $19,400. The coins, she would learn later when she had them appraised at a shop in Asheville, were worth another $12,800, mostly in silver content. $32,200, hidden under the floorboards of a mill house that had sold for $10 at a tax sale because nobody wanted it. At the bottom of the crate, beneath the last jar, was a leather pouch tied with a piece of twine that had gone stiff and brittle with age. Wren untied it carefully, worried the leather might fall apart in her hands. Inside the pouch was a folded piece of paper, dry and fragile, written in pencil in a careful, deliberate hand. She unfolded it and began to read. "My name is Ezra Whitmore. I have run this mill since 1921. My father ran it before me since 1889. My grandfather built it in 1871 with stones he cut from the creek bed himself. This money is what I have earned and saved over 40 years of grinding corn and wheat for the people of this valley. I put it here because I do not trust banks. Banks are for flatlanders. Banks are for men who wear suits and shake hands while they pick your pocket. I am not a flatlander. I am a miller, and a miller keeps what he earns close to where he works. If you are reading this letter, you have found my mill and you have found my savings. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you are reading this, but I know this much. You came looking. You walked the trail. You pushed through the door. You climbed the stairs. You noticed the loose boards. That tells me something about you. It tells me you are the kind of person who pays attention, the kind of person who does not give up easy, the kind of person this mill needs. Use the money to keep the mill standing. The stones are good. The creek is clean. The wheel can be fixed. A mill is a useful thing. A place that turns grain into flour is a place that feeds people. As long as this mill stands, someone will be fed. But there is something else you need to know. There are men who want this land. There have always been men who want this land. When I was young, a man named Warren Harmon came to me with an offer. He wanted to buy the mill and tear it down and build a factory in its place. He said he would make me rich. I said no. He did not take no for an answer. He came back with lawyers. He came back with threats. He came back with offers that sounded like kindness but smelled like greed. I told him no every time. He is dead now, I think, or close to it. But men like him do not die. They just pass their hunger to their children, and their children pass it to their children, and the hunger keeps growing because it is never enough. If they come for you, if they tell you this land belongs to them, if they try to take what you have found, remember this. The mill was built with stones from this creek. The flour it grinds feeds people in this valley. The wheel turns because the water flows, and the water will keep flowing long after all of us are gone. You cannot own a creek. You cannot own the water, and you cannot own a mill that has been feeding people for 150 years. Don't let them win. Ezra Whitmore, April 1958. Wren read the letter 3 times. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest and sat in the empty room above the creek while the afternoon light faded and the shadows grew long. She did not cry. Wren Calloway did not cry, but she felt something shift inside her like a door she had not known was there, swinging open to reveal a room she had never seen. The room was warm. The room was quiet. The room was hers. She slept that night on the chestnut floor, wrapped in her jacket with the leather pouch tucked inside her shirt against her skin. The creek murmured beneath her like a lullaby, sung by the mountain itself, and the stars shone through the holes in the roof. And for the first time in her life, she fell asleep without being afraid of what morning would bring. The next 3 weeks were the hardest work of Wren's life. She deposited the money at a bank in Marshall, keeping $500 in cash for immediate expenses. She bought a truck, a 1999 Toyota pickup with almost 200,000 miles on it, and a rust spot on the tailgate the size of a dinner plate. The mechanic who sold it to her showed her how to change the oil, and she did it herself that same afternoon, lying on a piece of cardboard in his parking lot, learning by doing the way she had learned everything. She bought supplies, tarps and tools and nails and lumber, a sleeping bag rated for winter, a camp stove and a cast iron pan and a water filter. She loaded everything into the truck and drove to the end of the forest road and carried it in on her back 40 pounds at a time, 2 trips a day, 4 miles total. She was small, but it was strong in the way that small things are sometimes strong, wiry and stubborn, the kind of strength that comes not from size but from refusal to stop. The first month was the roof. She bought shingles and roofing felt at a supply store in Marshall and carried them in over 3 days. She tore off the damaged section on the left side, working carefully to avoid falling through the rotten wood. She replaced the bad rafters with new lumber she cut to size in the mill room below and hauled up through a window using a rope and pulley she rigged herself. She laid new shingles row by row, starting at the bottom and working up. The first row was crooked, and she pulled it up and did it again. The second row was better. By the 10th row, she had found a rhythm, nail slide overlap, nail slide overlap. A pattern her hands learned before her brain understood. When the last shingle was down and she stood on the ground and looked up at a complete solid roof, she sat on the bank of the creek and ate a sandwich and felt something she had never felt before. Pride. She had built that, not perfectly, not professionally, but she had built it, and nobody could take it away from her. 3.5 weeks after she moved in on a Tuesday afternoon, when she was halfway through installing the windows, She had ordered from Asheville. She heard the sound of an engine on the forest road below. That was unusual. The forest road was technically public, but hardly anyone drove it. It was too rough, too far from anywhere useful, too much trouble for too little reward. Wren stopped what she was doing and listened. The engine sound grew louder, then stopped. A car door slammed. Footsteps on the trail. Not hiking boots, something harder. Dress shoes, maybe. 15 minutes later, a man appeared around the bend in the trail. He was in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered with silver hair and a face that had been shaped by decades of getting what he wanted. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Wren's truck and shoes that were already ruined from the walk through the woods, and he moved with the confident stride of someone who believed that any path he walked on belonged to him. He stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the mill house. Then he looked at Wren standing on a ladder with a pane of glass in her hands. "So it is true," he said. "Someone actually bought this place." Wren did not answer. She climbed down the ladder and set the glass carefully against the wall. "My name is Colton Harmon," the man said. He walked closer, picking his way through the mud with obvious distaste. "I am the president of Harmon Development. We are building an eco-resort and wellness retreat 5 miles down the valley. Perhaps you've seen the signs." Wren had not seen any signs. She had not been 5 miles down the valley since she moved in, but she said nothing. "I wanted to meet you," Colton continued. He stopped about 10 feet away and put his hands in his pockets. "A young woman all alone out here fixing up a building that has been abandoned for 60 years. That takes courage, or foolishness." He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "I have not decided which." Wren looked at him. He looked like every man who had ever talked down to her, like every man who had ever assumed she was stupid because she was small, because she was young, because she was female. "Can I help you with something?" she said. Colton laughed. "Straight to the point. I like that." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a check. He held it up so Wren could see the number written on it. $75,000, he said. "That is my offer for this property. The building, the land, everything. You paid $10 for it 3 weeks ago. I'm offering you 7,500 times your investment. That is a better return than Warren Buffett ever made." Wren looked at the check. She looked at Colton. She looked at the mill house behind her, the stone walls and the new roof and the windows waiting to be installed. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why do you want it? There are plenty of other places to build a resort. Why this one?" Colton's smile flickered just for a moment before he got it back under control. "This valley is a special place," he said. "The mountains, the creek, the forest. People will pay good money to experience this kind of natural beauty, but they need somewhere to stay, somewhere comfortable, somewhere that makes them feel like they are roughing it without actually having to rough it." He gestured at the mill house. "This building is a liability. It is old and dangerous and impossible to reach. I want to tear it down and build access roads and lodges and hiking trails with scenic overlooks. I want to turn this valley into something people can enjoy. Something people can pay to enjoy," Wren said. Colton shrugged. "That is how the world works. Nothing wrong with making money." He held up the check again. $75,000. That is life-changing money for someone your age. You could go to college, buy a real house, start a business, do anything you want. Wren looked at the check. She thought about what she could do with $75,000. She thought about college and houses and businesses. Then she thought about the letter folded in the pocket of her jacket. "Don't let them win." "No," she said. Colton blinked. "No, I'm not selling." For a long moment, Colton just stared at her. The smile was gone now. What was left underneath was something harder, something colder. "You do not understand," he said. His voice had dropped, lost its friendly tone. I have been buying land in this valley for 15 years. Every farm, every woodlot, every hunting cabin, all of it. This is the last piece, the final parcel I need to complete my project. He took a step closer. My grandfather tried to buy this property from Ezra Whitmore 70 years ago. The old man refused, said the mill was more important than money, said he would rather die than sell. He paused. And he did die. Alone. In this building, with his savings rotting under the floorboards because he was too stubborn to put it in a bank like a civilized person. Ren's heart was pounding. He knew about the money. Somehow he knew. I am offering you a chance to be smarter than he was, Colton said. Take the check, walk away, go live your life somewhere else. Ren looked at him. He was bigger than her, richer than her, more powerful than her in every way that mattered in the outside world. But this was not the outside world. This was her mill, her creek, her mountain. No, she said again. I'm not selling. Not for 75,000, not for any amount. Colton's face went still. The charm was gone. What remained was something she recognized, something she had seen in Lyle's eyes on nights when the bourbon ran out before his anger did. You are making a mistake, he said. This is not a negotiation. This is me being polite. One time, because you are young and you do not know how the world works. He turned and started walking back toward the trail. After a few steps, he stopped and looked over his shoulder. My grandfather wanted this land, he said. My father wanted this land. I want this land. The Harmon family does not give up. We do not walk away. We get what we want one way or another. He smiled, and this time there was nothing friendly in it at all. You have 30 days to reconsider. After that, I stopped being polite. Then he turned and walked back down the trail. His ruined dress shoes slipping on the wet rocks, and Ren stood in front of her mill house and watched him go, and felt the weight of the letter in her pocket like a hand on her shoulder. Don't let them win. She did not intend to. The days after Colton Harmon's visit were the quietest of Ren's life. Not quiet in the sense of peaceful. Quiet in the sense of waiting. The kind of quiet that comes before a storm, when the birds stop singing and the wind dies down and the whole world seems to hold its breath. Ren did not hold her breath. She worked. She finished the windows first. 8 panes of glass, each one carried up the trail wrapped in blankets and held against her chest like something precious. She glazed them herself, pressing putty into the old stone frames with her thumb, fitting each pane until it sat solid and still and caught the light like water. When all 8 windows were in, and she stood in the upstairs room and looked out through clean glass at the forest and the creek, the room filled with green light so clear and bright it looked like being inside an emerald. She fixed the floor next. She pulled up the loose chestnut planks around the fireplace, the ones that had hidden Ezra's treasure for 60 years, and checked the joists beneath for rot. 2 had softened from decades of moisture seeping through the damaged roof. She replaced them with new lumber measuring twice and cutting once the way the man at the hardware store had told her. And then she relaid the original planks, sanding them by hand until the old chestnut grain appeared dark and warm and rippled with the marks of tools from 1871. She cleaned the fireplace by hand, scraping decades of creosote from the chimney with a wire brush taped to a long branch, pushing it up from below until black flakes rained down into the hearth like dark snow. She tested the draw by lighting a small fire of twigs and dry leaves and watching the smoke. It pulled straight up and out, disappearing into the sky above the damaged section of roof she had already repaired. The chimney was clear. The fireplace worked. She could have heat now, real heat, the kind that came from burning wood and filled a room with warmth that sank into your bones. She installed a hand pump at the kitchen area she was building against the wall, running a line down through the floor, through the mill room below, and into the creek through the stone archway. Cold, clean mountain water, gravity-fed and constant. She pumped the handle, and water came out clear and sweet, and so cold it made her teeth ache when she drank it. For electricity, she started small. A single solar panel mounted on the south-facing wall above the roofline connected to a battery she kept in the mill room below. Enough for a light, a phone charger, and a small radio she found at a thrift store in Hot Springs that picked up exactly one station, a public radio affiliate out of Asheville that played classical music in the evenings and news in the mornings. The work was hard. The work was endless. Every day brought new problems, new challenges, new things she did not know how to do and had to figure out through trial and error, and the occasional trip to the library in Marshall where she read books about plumbing and wiring and carpentry until her eyes ached. But every night when she lay in the bed she had built from locust posts and chestnut planks, listening to the creek murmur beneath her, and the radio play something soft and classical in the corner, she felt something she had never felt before. She felt like she was becoming someone. Not the invisible girl from Lyle's house, not the quiet worker from Mabel's bakery. Someone new. Someone who could look at a broken thing and fix it. Someone who could look at an impossible task and do it anyway. Someone who belonged. 6 weeks after she moved in on a morning when the spring sun was warm enough to work without a jacket, she heard footsteps on the trail. Her body tensed immediately. She'd been expecting Colton to come back. Every day she woke up wondering if this would be the day he returned with lawyers or threats or whatever else men like him used to get what they wanted. But the footsteps were wrong, too slow, too careful, and there was a sound underneath them, a soft tapping like a cane on stone. Wren climbed down from the ladder where she had been working on the water wheel and walked around to the front of the mill. An old woman was making her way up the trail. She was small, even smaller than Wren, with white hair pulled back in a bun and a face that had been weathered by 84 years of mountain living. She wore rubber boots and a sun hat and a jacket that looked like it had been washed 1,000 times, and she carried a walking stick made from a gnarled branch that had been polished smooth by years of handling. She was not breathing hard. She was not struggling. She walked with the steady, patient pace of someone who had been walking these trails since before Wren's mother was born. When she reached the clearing, she stopped and looked at the mill house. She looked at the new roof and the new windows and the water wheel that Wren had been working on. She looked at Wren standing there in work clothes with sawdust in her hair and dirt on her hands. Then she smiled. She said, "I will be damned." Her name was Opal. She was 84 years old, and she had grown up on a farm 3 miles down the creek, and she had heard from someone who had heard from someone else that a young woman was living in the old Whitmore mill and fixing it up with her own 2 hands. "I had to see it for myself," she said. She was sitting at Wren's table now, drinking coffee that Wren had made on the camp stove, holding the cup in both hands like it was something precious. I didn't believe it was possible. This place has been empty since I was 24 years old, 60 years. I thought it would fall down before anyone ever lived here again. "Why did you come?" Wren asked. Opal looked at her. Her eyes were sharp, clearer than Wren had expected in someone so old. "Because I knew Ezra Whitmore," she said. "When I was a girl, my mother used to send me up here with a sack of corn. I would sit on that rock by the creek," she pointed through the window at a flat stone beside the water, "and wait while Ezra ground it into meal. He always gave me a biscuit when I was done, made them himself on that wood stove he had in the corner." She paused and took a sip of coffee. "I am 84 years old," she said, "and I can still taste that biscuit." Wren did not know what to say. She had been so focused on the work on the building, on the letter and the money, and the threat from Colton Harmon that she had not thought much about the people who had come before her. The families who had brought their grain to this mill for 100 years. The lives that had been shaped by these stones and this creek and this place. What was he like, she asked. Ezra. Opal set down her coffee cup and looked out the window at the creek. He was quiet, she said, the kind of quiet that comes from being comfortable with yourself. Some men are quiet because they have nothing to say. Ezra was quiet because he did not need to say anything. He just worked, ground the grain, kept the mill running, helped the people who came to him. She paused. But he was stubborn too. Lord, was he stubborn. When Warren Harmon came around trying to buy this place, Ezra told him no so many times I think the word wore a groove in his tongue. Wren leaned forward. Warren Harmon. Opal nodded. Colton's grandfather. Big man, rich man, owned half the county by the time he died. He wanted this valley for a resort or a factory or something. I do not remember what exactly. But he needed the mill to make it work, and Ezra would not sell. She shook her head slowly, remembering. Warren came up here 3-4 times that I know of. Brought lawyers once. Brought a sheriff's deputy once. Even brought a preacher once, tried to convince Ezra it was God's will that he sell. She chuckled, a dry sound like leaves rustling. Ezra listened to all of them. Then he said no. Same way every time. Just no. No explanation, no argument, no discussion. Just no. What happened? Wren asked. Nothing, Opal said. That is the thing about stubbornness. If you can outlast the other person, you win. Warren Harmon eventually gave up and went off to develop some other valley. Ezra stayed here and kept grinding grain until the day he died. She looked at Wren. That was 1962. I was 24. I remember hearing about it from my father. Said they found Ezra sitting in his chair by the fireplace like he had just fallen asleep and never woke up. Said he looked peaceful. She was quiet for a moment. Nobody ever lived here after that. The county could not find any family to claim the property. Ezra never married, never had children, never talked about where he came from before he took over the mill from his father. The place just sat here, empty, while the roof fell in and the wheels stopped turning and the forest started taking it back. She looked around the room at the new windows and the repaired floor and the clean fireplace. Until now, she said. Wren reached into her pocket and pulled out the letter. She unfolded it and handed it to Opal. Opal read it slowly, her lips moving slightly with the words. When she finished, she looked up at Wren with something in her eyes that might have been tears. He knew, she said. The old fool knew someone would come. He just had to wait 60 years for it to happen. She handed the letter back. Don't let them win, she said. That sounds like Ezra, stubborn to the end. She stood up using the table for support and picked up her walking stick. I will come back, she said. Every couple of weeks if you will have me. I want to see what you do with this place. I want to hear that wheel turning again before I die. She paused at the door and looked back. And bring you things, she added. Honey, pickled ramps, maybe some socks. You look like you could use some good wool socks. Then she walked out the door and down the trail. Her rubber boots splashing through the puddles, her walking stick tapping against the stones. And Wren watched her go and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was tight. She was not alone. She had Mabel. She had Opal now. And she had the memory of Ezra Whitmore, who had stood in this same place and said no to men who wanted to take what he had built. She could say no too. The water wheel took 3 weeks to repair. Wren had never fixed a water wheel before. She had never even seen a working water wheel before, except in pictures. But she had the bones of the old one to work with, and she had books from the library, and she had something more important than experience. She had time. The broken paddles were the first problem. 3 of them were gone entirely, rotted away to nothing over 60 years of exposure. The others were cracked and warped and held together more by moss than by wood. Wren replaced them one by one. She felled a white oak on the hillside above the mill, choosing a tree that was straight and tall and free of disease. She cut it into sections with the chainsaw she borrowed from a farmer down the valley, a man named Vernon who had heard about her from Mabel, and who showed up one day with the chainsaw and a tank of gas and an offer to help. She did not want help. She wanted to do it herself. But she accepted the chainsaw and the gas and Vernon's patient explanations of how to use them without cutting off her own leg. She shaped each paddle with a draw knife sitting on a stump beside the mill, with the wood between her knees, shaving off thin curls of oak, until the paddle was smooth and flat and exactly the right size to fit into the wheel frame. It was slow work, meditative, the kind of work where your hands do one thing and your mind does another, and hours pass without you noticing. She fitted the new paddles into the wheel frame with wooden pegs, drilling holes, and carving pegs and hammering them into place until each paddle was solid and secure. The cracked axle was harder. The original was a massive piece of timber almost a foot thick that had held the wheel in place for over 100 years before finally giving out. Replacing it properly would have required equipment Wren did not have and skills she had not learned. So she improvised. She found a straight piece of locust in the forest, a tree that had fallen years ago, and seasoned naturally the wood hard and dense and almost as strong as metal. She rigged a makeshift lathe using the spare tire from her truck as a drive wheel and a drill as a motor, and she turned the locust log until it was round and smooth and exactly the right diameter to fit the iron brackets that held the wheel to the building. It took 4 days. Her arms ached. Her back ached. Her hands were blistered and raw from the constant vibration of the drill. But when she was done, she had an axle. She rehung the wheel on a Tuesday morning in late April, working alone because she had refused Vernon's offer of help again, using a system of ropes and pulleys and leverage that would have made an engineer either proud or horrified. The wheel settled into place with a groan of wood against iron. The new axle slid into the brackets. The paddles hung straight and true, ready to catch the water. Wren climbed down from the scaffolding she had built and walked to the sluice gate that controlled the flow of water from the creek to the wheel. The gate was a simple wooden panel that slid up and down in a stone channel. It had been closed for 60 years, stuck in place by mud and debris and the slow accumulation of time. She grabbed the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. She pulled harder, putting her whole weight into it, her boots sliding in the mud, her shoulders straining. The gate groaned, shifted, moved an inch. She pulled again, another inch, another, and then with a sound like a sigh, the gate came free and slid upward, and water rushed through the channel and hit the paddles of the water wheel with a force that made the whole building shudder. The wheel began to turn. Slowly at first, groaning and creaking and dripping the old wood, complaining about being asked to work after so long a rest. But then faster as the water found its rhythm and the paddles caught their stride, and the wheel began to spin the way it had been spinning for 150 years before Ezra Whitmore died in his chair by the fireplace. Wren walked into the mill room below and watched the grinding stones begin to rotate. The mechanism connecting the wheel to the stones was old and stiff and needed oil. But it worked. The gears turned, the shafts spun, and the 2 great discs of granite, each one cut by hand from a single piece of stone, began to rub against each other with a low, heavy rumbling sound that Wren could feel in her chest and in the soles of her feet and in some deep place inside her that had never been touched before. The mill was alive. For the first time in 60 years, the Whitmore mill was grinding again. Wren stood in the doorway and watched the stones turn and listened to the sound of water and machinery and history all working together, and she understood for the first time what Ezra had meant in his letter. A mill is a useful thing. A place that turns grain into flour is a place that feeds people. She was not just fixing a building. She was bringing something back to life. Something that mattered, something that fed people and connected them and gave them a reason to walk up a 2-mile trail through the forest just to watch the wheel turn and feel the stones rumble and remember a time when things were simpler. That evening she sat on the flat rock by the creek where Opal had once sat as a little girl waiting for Ezra to grind her corn, and she watched the sun go down through the trees and listened to the wheel creak and splash behind her. She had done it. She had actually done it, and nobody could take that away from her. Vernon came back a week later with 50 pounds of corn in the bed of his truck. He was a big man in his 60s with hands like shovels and a face that had been weathered by decades of farming in the mountain valleys of North Carolina. He did not say much. He just parked at the end of the forest road and loaded the corn into a canvas sack and carried it up the trail like it weighed nothing. "Heard the mill is running again," he said when he reached the clearing. "Figured I would be the first to test it." Wren ground the corn that afternoon while Vernon sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the wheel turn. The grinding took about 2 hours. When it was done, she had 40 pounds of cornmeal, golden and coarse, and smelling like the grain it came from. Vernon took a handful and let it run through his fingers. "That is good meal," he said. "Better than anything you can buy in a store." He looked at Wren. "What are you charging?" Wren had not thought about charging anything. She'd been so focused on fixing the mill that she had not considered what would happen once it was fixed. "I do not know," she said. Vernon nodded. Ezra used to take a share of the flour, 1 pound out of every 10, something like that. Seemed fair to everyone. "That sounds fair to me," Wren said. Vernon loaded his cornmeal into the truck and drove away. But he came back the following week with more corn. And he brought his neighbor a woman named Ruth who grew wheat on the sunny slopes above the valley. And Ruth brought her cousin a man named Douglas who had been saving a harvest of rye in his barn for 3 years because he could not find anyone to grind it. Word spread the way it always spreads in mountain communities through conversations at church and encounters at the feed store and quiet words exchanged over fences between neighbors who had known each other for generations. The Whitmore mill is running again. There is a young woman up there fixing the place up, grinding grain the old way. By the end of May, Wren was grinding 200 pounds of grain a week. By the middle of June, she was grinding 400. Farmers she had never met showed up at the trailhead with sacks of corn and wheat and rye, and they hiked up the trail and sat on the porch while the wheel turned and the stones rumbled, and they went home with flour that tasted like something their grandparents would have recognized. Mabel sold the flour at Honey and Rye. Whitmore millstone ground $6 a pound, displayed in brown paper bags with a hand-drawn label that Wren had designed herself. It sold out every week. People drove from Asheville and Boone and as far away as Knoxville just to buy a bag of flour that had been ground the way flour was ground before electricity and factories, and the modern world changed everything. The money was not much, but it was enough to buy supplies, enough to pay the property taxes that would come due in the fall, enough to prove that the mill was not just a building but a business, a working enterprise that contributed to the community and the economy in the valley that had been feeding people for 150 years. Wren started keeping records. Every bag of grain that came in, every pound of flour that went out, every farmer who made the trek up the trail. She wrote it all down in a ledger she bought at an office supply store in Marshall, using the same careful handwriting she had learned in school, creating a history of the mill's rebirth, one entry at a time. Opal came back every 2 weeks just as she had promised. She brought honey and pickled ramps and dried apples, and once a pair of wool socks she had knitted herself. She sat on the porch and watched the wheel turn and told stories about Ezra and the valley and the way things used to be before the world got so fast and complicated. She told Wren about the families who had brought their grain to this mill for generations. The Hendersons and the Carters and the Pryors and the Moores, names that were still on mailboxes throughout the valley, descendants of the people who had watched this wheel turn when they were children, who had eaten bread made from flour that these stones had ground. She told Wren about Warren Harmon, too, about how he had made his money in timber and textiles, and how he had spent his later years buying up land throughout the county, assembling parcels like pieces of a puzzle, always looking for the next big development. He was not a bad man, Opal said one afternoon, choosing her words carefully, but he was a hungry man. The kind of hungry that is never satisfied no matter how much you feed it. He wanted this valley because it was beautiful, and he thought beautiful things should belong to him. She shook her head. Ezra did not see beauty as something to own. He saw it as something to protect. That is why he said no. Not because he hated Warren Harmon, but because he loved this place more than he loved money. She looked at Wren. "I think you might be the same way," she said. Wren did not know what to say to that. She had never thought of herself as someone who loved anything. Love was a word for other people, people with families, and homes and lives that made sense. She was just surviving, just doing what needed to be done. But when she lay in bed at night and listened to the creek and the wheel and the forest breathing all around her, she wondered if maybe Opal was right. Maybe what she felt for this place, this mill, this life she was building, maybe that was love after all. The letter from the county arrived on a Monday morning in the middle of July. Wren found it tucked into the door of her truck when she came down the trail for supplies. A white envelope with an official seal and her name typed neatly on the front. She opened it, standing in the parking area, the sun hot on her shoulders. The sound of the creek, distant and muffled through the trees. The letter was from the Madison County Department of Code Enforcement. It informed her that a complaint had been filed regarding the property known as the Whitmore Mill on Laurel Creek. An inspection had been conducted in her absence, and the inspector had found numerous violations of county building and health codes. The violations were listed in neat rows. Operating a food processing facility without proper licensing, failure to meet sanitation standards for commercial food production, inadequate electrical systems, inadequate plumbing, failure to obtain required permits for structural modifications. The letter concluded with a notice that all commercial operations at the property were to cease immediately pending a formal hearing before the county board. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks from the date of the letter. Wren read the letter 3 times. Her hands were shaking again the way they had shaken when Colton Harmon first appeared, the way they had shaken when she stood in front of the county council in the future that had not happened yet. She knew who had filed the complaint. She did not need to see his name on the paper to know. There was a second letter in the envelope. This one was from a law firm in Asheville representing Harmon Development, LLC. It informed her that Harmon Development was challenging the validity of the tax sale through which she had acquired the property on the grounds that the sale had not been properly advertised and that the property should have been classified as a historic site requiring special review before disposition. A court date had been set, 60 days from now. The letter noted that Harmon Development was prepared to offer a generous settlement to avoid the expense and inconvenience of litigation. All Wren had to do was sign the enclosed documents transferring ownership of the property to Harmon Development, and she would receive $100,000 in compensation. $100,000, more money than Wren had ever imagined having, more than enough to start over somewhere else, to go to college, to build a different life. All she had to do was give up. She folded both letters and put them in her pocket and drove back to the trailhead and hiked up to the mill. The wheel was still turning. The stones were still grinding. Vernon had dropped off a load of corn that morning, and the mill room was filled with the warm, dusty smell of fresh meal. Wren stood in the doorway and looked at what she had built. The repaired roof, the clean windows, the restored wheel, the grinding stones that had been silent for 60 years and were now rumbling again, doing the work they had been made to do. She thought about Colton Harmon in his charcoal suit telling her that the Harmon family did not give up. She thought about Warren Harmon coming to this same place 70 years ago, offering money and threats and everything else he could think of to convince Ezra Whitmore to sell. Ezra had said no. For 40 years, through lawyers and sheriffs and preachers, Ezra had said no. And then he had died alone in his chair by the fireplace, and the mill had sat empty for 60 years, and everyone thought the Harmon family had won just by waiting. But Ezra had not given up. He had hidden his savings under the floorboards. He had written a letter to someone he would never meet. He had trusted that someday, somehow, someone would come. And someone had. Wren took the letters out of her pocket and looked at them again. The cease and desist, the court date, the settlement offer. Then she walked to the fireplace and threw them into the flames and watched them burn. She was not going to give up either. The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Wren's life. She could not grind grain. The cease and desist order was clear about that. Any commercial activity and she would face fines, arrest, worse. So she did something else instead. She researched. She drove to the library in Marshall every day and sat at the computers and looked up everything she could find about property law and tax sales and historic preservation and code enforcement. She read case files and statutes and regulations until her eyes blurred and her head ached. She learned that the tax sale had been conducted properly. The notices had been published. The procedures had been followed. Colton's lawyers were grasping at straws, hoping that the cost and complexity of litigation would be enough to make her give up. She learned that the code violations were real, but fixable. She needed licenses and permits and inspections, all of which cost money and took time, but none of which were impossible. She learned that historic preservation cuts both ways. If the mill was classified as a historic site, it could not be demolished or substantially altered without review. Colton wanted to use that classification to challenge her ownership, but she could use the same classification to protect the mill from his development plans. She drove to the county offices and talked to clerks and inspectors and whoever else would listen. She was polite and persistent and refused to go away, and eventually she found people who were willing to help. A building inspector named Thomas, who had grown up in the valley and remembered his grandfather talking about the Whitmore Mill. A health department official named Patricia, who thought what Wren was doing was interesting and was willing to explain exactly what she needed to do to get properly licensed. She applied for permits. She scheduled inspections. She filled out paperwork until her hand cramped and her signature started to look like someone else's. And in the evenings, when the offices were closed and the library was dark, she went back to the mill and sat on the porch and watched the wheel turn and wondered if any of it would be enough. One evening, about a week before the county hearing, she was sitting on the flat rock by the creek when she noticed something she had never noticed before. The mill room had a floor made of large flat stones fitted together without mortar, each one worn smooth by a century of boots and grain sacks and the constant traffic of work. She had swept that floor 100 times. She had mopped it and scrubbed it and gotten down on her hands and knees to clean the cracks between the stones, but she had never looked underneath it. The thought came to her suddenly, the way important thoughts sometimes do, appearing fully formed in her mind, as if it had been waiting there all along. Ezra had hidden money under the floorboards upstairs. What else might he have hidden? She went into the mill room and knelt on the stone floor and began to examine it more carefully. The stones were heavy, maybe 100 pounds each, but they were not mortared in place. They were just sitting there, held down by their own weight. In the corner near the old grinding mechanism, she found a stone that was slightly different from the others, slightly smaller, slightly more worn around the edges, as if it had been lifted and replaced many times over many years. She got her fingers under the edge and lifted. The stone came up more easily than she expected, revealing a dark cavity beneath. The smell that came out was old and musty, the smell of air that had been trapped for decades. Wren got her flashlight and pointed it into the hole. There was another wooden crate down there, smaller than the first one, but made the same way with rope handles and rough sawn boards. She pulled it out and set it on the floor and opened the lid. Inside were papers. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all carefully preserved in waxed canvas, the same way the money had been preserved upstairs. She pulled them out one by one and spread them on the grinding stones and began to read. The first stack was a ledger, 40 years of records written in Ezra's careful hand. Every bag of grain that had come into the mill, every pound of flour that had gone out, names and dates and weights and amounts, a complete history of the mill's operations from 1921 to 1958. She counted the names. 127 families, 127 households that had depended on this mill for their flour and meal and the bread that kept them alive. The second stack was correspondence. Letters from farmers thanking Ezra for his help during hard times. Letters from neighbors asking for advice. Letters from people who had moved away but still remembered the taste of bread made from Whitmore mill flour. And at the bottom of the crate, in an envelope that had been sealed with wax, was another letter. This one was not written by Ezra. The handwriting was different, more aggressive, slashing across the page in hard, dark strokes. The letterhead said, Harmon Industries, Asheville, North Carolina. The date was April 1955. Dear Mr. Whitmore, I am writing to inform you that your continued refusal to negotiate has consequences. I have made you fair offers for your property and you have rejected everyone. I have been patient, but my patience is not unlimited. I have spoken with the county tax assessor. Your property valuation is about to increase substantially. The property taxes you will owe next year will be triple what you paid this year. I have spoken with the bank in Marshall. They are reconsidering the terms of your account. I have spoken with the farmers who bring their grain to your mill. Some of them owe me money. They will be encouraged to take their business elsewhere. I'm not making threats. I'm simply informing you of reality. You are an old man with no family and no future. Your mill is obsolete. The world has moved on. Sell to me now and you can live out your days in comfort. Refuse and I will make the rest of your life very difficult. The choice is yours. Warren Harmon. Wren read the letter 3 times. Then she read it a 4th time more slowly, letting every word sink in. Warren Harmon had not just tried to buy the mill. He had tried to destroy Ezra. He had used his money and his connections to pressure and threaten and intimidate to squeeze Ezra from every direction until selling seemed like the only option. And Ezra had not sold. For 7 more years, through whatever hardships Warren Harmon had manufactured, Ezra had held on to his mill and kept grinding grain and refused to give in. He had kept this letter. He had preserved it the same way he preserved his money and his records hidden under the floor where no one would find it. Evidence of what had been done to him. Evidence of who the Harmon family really was. And now, 60 years later, another Harmon was doing the same thing to another person in the same place. Wren gathered up all the papers and put them back in the crate and carried the crate upstairs. She sat at her table with the ledger open in front of her, and she looked at the names. 127 families, 3 generations of history, all of it recorded in careful pencil marks that had survived 6 decades in a hole in the ground. Ezra had not just hidden money, he had hidden proof. Proof that the mill mattered. Proof that it had fed and served and supported an entire valley for over 100 years. Proof that the Harmon family had tried to destroy it before and failed. He had prepared for this. He had known that someday the Harmons would come back, and he had left weapons for whoever came after him. Wren looked at the threatening letter from Warren Harmon. She looked at the ledger with its 127 names. She looked at the letters from farmers and neighbors and friends, all of them testifying to what the mill had meant to this valley. Then she looked out the window at the water wheel still turning, still catching the water, still doing the work it had been built to do. She knew what she had to do now. She knew how to fight back. The hearing was in 1 week. She had a lot of work to do. The week before the hearing was the longest week of Wren's life. She did not sleep much. She did not eat much. She spent her days at the table in the upstairs room, surrounded by papers, reading and rereading and organizing, until she knew every name in Ezra's ledger, every word in Warren Harmon's threatening letter, every detail of the history she was trying to protect. She made copies of everything. She drove to the library in Marshall and used the photocopier until she had duplicates of every document, every letter, every page of the ledger. She put the originals back in the wooden crate and hid them under the floor where Ezra had kept them for 60 years. The copies she organized into folders labeled and tabbed and ready to present. She practiced what she was going to say. Standing in the mill room with the wheel turning behind her, she spoke to the empty air as if it were a room full of county officials. She stumbled over words and lost her train of thought, and had to start over again and again until the sentences came out smooth and clear and sounded like something a person might actually believe. She was not a lawyer. She was not a speaker. She was an 18-year-old girl who had been thrown out of her house with a garbage bag full of clothes and $10 in her pocket. But she had something the lawyers did not have. She had the truth, and she had the words of a man who had been dead for 60 years but had somehow known she was coming. 3 days before the hearing, Opal came up the trail. She was carrying her walking stick and her usual sun hat, but there was something different about the way she moved, faster, more purposeful, like she had somewhere to be and not much time to get there. "I have been busy," she said when she reached the porch. She sat down heavily in the chair Wren had put out for her and took a moment to catch her breath. "I've been making phone calls." "Phone calls," Wren said. Opal nodded. "To people I have not talked to in years, people whose families are in that ledger of yours." She reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I found 12 of them," she said. 12 people whose grandparents or great-grandparents brought grain to this mill when Ezra was alive. 12 people who are willing to come to the hearing and tell the county what this place meant to their families. Wren took the paper and unfolded it. There were names and phone numbers written in Opal's shaky handwriting, 12 entries in a column down the page. "You did this," Wren said. "You found all these people." Opal shrugged. "I made some calls, asked some questions. People in these mountains have long memories. They remember when things were different, when neighbors helped each other and mills ground grain and life made sense. She looked at Wren with those sharp old eyes. They want to help, she said. Not because they know you. Oh, they do not know you, but they know what you are trying to save. And they remember what the Harmon family tried to do to Ezra all those years ago. She paused. Warren Harmon was not well liked around here, she said. He had money and power, but he did not have respect. People saw what he did to Ezra. They saw how he tried to squeeze him out, destroy him, take what he had built. They did not forget. She tapped the paper with one gnarled finger. These 12 people are coming to that hearing because they want to finish what Ezra started. They want to tell the Harmon family once and for all that this valley is not for sale. Wren looked at the list of names. 12 strangers who were willing to stand up and speak for a mill they had never visited, for a girl they had never met, because their families had eaten bread made from flour. These stones had ground. She felt something shift in her chest, something that had been tight and hard for weeks, loosening just slightly. "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out rough and she had to clear her throat. "Thank you for doing this." Opal waved her hand dismissively. "Do not thank me yet. We have not won anything. All we have done is show up to the fight." She stood up and picked up her walking stick. "Now," she said, "let me tell you about these people. Let me tell you their stories, so when you stand up in front of that county board, you know who you are fighting for." She stayed for 3 hours. She told Wren about each of the 12 names on the list, about their families, their histories, their connections to this valley and this mill and this place that had been feeding people for 150 years. She told Wren about Margaret Pryor, who was 72, and whose grandmother had walked 5 miles every month to bring corn to Ezra for grinding. About Thomas Henderson, who was 68, and whose father had helped Ezra repair the water wheel in 1947 after a storm knocked a tree into it. About Ruth Ann Carter, who was 80, and who remembered sitting on the flat rock by the creek as a little girl waiting for Ezra to finish grinding eating biscuits he made himself on the wood stove in the corner. 12 names, 12 stories, 12 threads connecting the present to the past, connecting Wren to a community she had not known existed. When Opal left, walking slowly down the trail in the fading afternoon light, Wren sat on the porch and looked at the list and felt something she had not felt since the day Colton Harmon first appeared. Hope. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning in the Madison County Courthouse in Marshall. Wren arrived early before the doors were open and sat on a bench in the hallway outside the hearing room. She was wearing the nicest clothes she owned, a pair of dark pants and a white blouse she had bought at a thrift store in Hot Springs, and she had her folders of documents in a canvas bag beside her. The hallway filled slowly as the morning went on. County employees walking past with coffee cups and folders of their own, lawyers in suits checking their phones, ordinary citizens here to deal with ordinary business permits and licenses and all the small bureaucratic machinery that keeps a county running. At 9:30, a black SUV pulled up outside the courthouse. Wren saw it through the window at the end of the hallway. She watched as Colton Harmon stepped out of the passenger side, followed by 2 men in suits who were clearly lawyers. They walked up the courthouse steps together, talking in low voices, their shoes clicking on the marble floor as they entered the building. Colton saw Wren sitting on the bench. He paused for a moment, looking at her with an expression that might have been surprise or contempt or something in between. Then he smiled, the same smile he had given her at the mill all those months ago, the one that did not reach his eyes. "Still here," he said. "I thought you might have come to your senses by now." Wren did not answer. She just looked at him, keeping her face still, keeping her hands folded in her lap so he could not see them shaking. Colton shook his head and walked past her into the hearing room, his lawyers following behind. Over the next 20 minutes, other people began to arrive. Opal came first, walking slowly but steadily with her walking stick tapping against the floor. She sat down next to Wren on the bench and patted her hand without saying anything. Then the others began to appear. 12 people ranging in age from their 50s to their 80s, filing into the hallway and finding seats on the benches. Some of them Wren recognized from Opal's descriptions, others she had never seen before. They did not speak to each other much. They just sat there, waiting, their faces calm and determined. Ordinary people from the mountains of North Carolina here to tell the truth about something that had happened before most of them were born. At 10 o'clock, the doors to the hearing room opened and a clerk announced that the matter of Whitmore Mill was ready to be heard. Wren stood up. She picked up her canvas bag. She walked through the doors into the hearing room with Opal beside her and 12 strangers behind her. The room was smaller than she had expected. There was a raised platform at the front where 7 council members sat behind a long table. There were rows of wooden benches for the public like pews in a church. There was a podium on each side of the room, one for each party in the dispute. Colton Harmon was already standing at the podium on the left side, his lawyers arranged behind him like soldiers in formation. He had a stack of documents in front of him and a confident expression on his face. Wren walked to the podium on the right side. She set her canvas bag on the floor beside her and took out her folders and arranged them on the wooden surface in front of her. Her hands were shaking. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest so loud she was sure everyone in the room could hear it. But she didn't step back. She didn't look away. She just stood there, small and quiet and alone, waiting for the hearing to begin. The chairman of the county council was a man in his 60s named Harold Benson. He had gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses and the patient expression of someone who had spent decades listening to people argue about property lines and zoning variances. He called the hearing to order and explained the procedure. Colton Harmon, as the complainant, would speak first. Then Wren would have a chance to respond. Then the council would ask questions and eventually make a decision. It was simple. It was straightforward. It was also Wren understood the most important moment of her life. Colton stepped forward and began to speak. He was good. Wren had to admit that. He spoke with confidence and authority, using words that sounded reasonable and measured, building an argument that seemed logical on its surface. He talked about the tax sale and its irregularities. He talked about the historic significance of the property and the need for proper oversight. He talked about safety concerns and code violations and the danger of allowing an unlicensed operation to continue. He talked about his family's long history in the valley, about his grandfather Warren, who had been a pillar of the community, a job creator, a philanthropist, about his father, who had continued the family's tradition of development and growth, about himself, who only wanted to bring prosperity and opportunity to a region that had been left behind by the modern economy. He didn't mention the threatening letter. He didn't mention the pressure tactics. He didn't mention the decades of attempts to force Ezra Whitmore off his land. He just talked about progress and jobs in the future, as if the past did not exist. When he finished, he turned and looked at Wren with that same cold smile. "Your turn," he said. Wren stepped forward. The podium was too tall for her. She had to stand on her toes to see over it properly, and even then she felt small, dwarfed by the room and the council and the weight of everything that was happening. She took a breath. She looked at the 7 faces behind the table. She looked at Opal sitting in the front row with her walking stick across her knees. She looked at the 12 strangers who had come to speak for a mill they had never seen. Then she began. "My name is Wren Calloway. I'm 18 years old. 6 months ago, I bought the Whitmore Mill on Laurel Creek for $10 at a county tax sale. She paused. Mr. Harmon says the sale was irregular. It was not. I have copies of the public notices, the legal filings, the deed transfer. Everything was done according to procedure. The county clerk confirmed this when I bought the property. He can confirm it again now. She took a folder from her stack and held it up. Mr. Harmon says the property should have been classified as historic. Maybe it should have been, but it was not. That was the county's decision made years before I ever arrived. If Mr. Harmon wanted to challenge that classification, he had plenty of time to do it. He did not. He waited until someone else bought the property, someone who would not sell to him. She set the folder down and picked up another one. Mr. Harmon says there are code violations. He is right. There are. I am working to fix them. I have applied for the proper licenses. I have scheduled the required inspections. I am doing everything the county has asked me to do. She looked directly at the council members. But Mr. Harmon does not care about code violations. He does not care about historic preservation. He does not care about safety or regulations or any of the things he has talked about today. She picked up a single sheet of paper from her folder. He cares about this, she said. She began to read. Dear Mr. Whitmore, I am writing to inform you that your continued refusal to negotiate has consequences. I have spoken with the county tax assessor. Your property valuation is about to increase substantially. I have spoken with the bank in Marshall. They are reconsidering the terms of your account. I have spoken with the farmers who bring their grain to your mill. They will be encouraged to take their business elsewhere. I'm not making threats. I am simply informing you of reality. Sell to me now, and you can live out your days in comfort. Refuse, and I will make the rest of your life very difficult. She looked up from the paper. This letter was written in 1955 by Warren Harmon, Colton Harmon's grandfather. It was written to Ezra Whitmore, the man who ran the Whitmore Mill for 40 years. It was found hidden under the floor of the mill, along with records and documents that Ezra preserved, because he knew that someday someone would need them. She held up the letter so everyone in the room could see it. 70 years ago, the Harmon family tried to destroy Ezra Whitmore. They raised his taxes. They pressured his bank. They told farmers not to bring him grain. They did everything they could to force him off his land. She set the letter down. Ezra did not sell. He held on for 7 more years, grinding grain, serving his community, refusing to give up. And when he died in 1962, he left behind evidence of what had been done to him. He left it hidden under the floor because he knew that someday the Harmon family would come back. She looked at Colton. He was no longer smiling. And now they have, she said. Mr. Harmon offered me $75,000 to sell. I said no. Then he offered $100,000. I said no. So now he is here using the legal system to do what his grandfather could not do with threats and pressure. She turned back to the council. I am not a lawyer. I am not a businesswoman. I am 18 years old. 6 months ago, I was sleeping on a cot in the back of a bakery because I had nowhere else to go. She paused. But I found that mill. I fixed it. I got the wheel turning again. I ground flour the way Ezra Whitmore ground it for 40 years, the way his father ground it before him, the way his grandfather ground it when he built the place in 1871. She picked up the ledger from her stack of documents. This is Ezra Whitmore's record book. It contains 40 years of entries. Every bag of grain that came into the mill, every pound of flour that went out, every family that depended on those stones to make their bread. She opened the book. She opened 127 families, 127 names, 3 generations of history written in pencil preserved under the floor of a building that everyone thought was abandoned. She looked at the council. Those families are not gone. Their descendants are still here. Some of them are in this room right now. She gestured toward the benches behind her. These 12 people came here today because their grandparents and great-grandparents brought grain to the Whitmore Mill. They came here because they remember what that mill meant to this valley. They came here because they want to tell you the truth about who Ezra Whitmore was and what the Harmon family tried to do to him. She stepped back from the podium. I am asking you to let them speak. Chairman Benson looked at the other council members. There was a brief whispered conversation. Then he nodded. We will hear from the witnesses, he said. One by one, the 12 people stood up and walked to the front of the room. Margaret Pryor went first. She was 72 years old, small and gray-haired, with hands that trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the podium. My grandmother was Bessie Pryor, she said. She lived on a farm about 6 miles from the Whitmore Mill. Every month she would walk to the mill with a sack of corn on her back. It took her 2 hours each way. She did it because Ezra Whitmore ground the best meal in the valley and because he was fair. He never cheated anyone. He never turned anyone away even if they could not pay. She paused. My grandmother told me stories about Ezra. She said he was quiet but kind. She said he worked harder than any man she knew. She said when Warren Harmon tried to shut him down, the whole valley stood behind him, even though they were afraid of what Harmon might do to them too. She looked at the council. I never met Ezra Whitmore. He died before I was born. But I know who he was because my grandmother told me, and I know what the Harmon family is because my grandmother told me that too. She stepped back and returned to her seat. Thomas Henderson went next. He was 68, a big man with weathered hands and a quiet voice. My father helped Ezra repair the water wheel in 1947, he said. A storm knocked a tree into it, broke 3 of the paddles, cracked the axle. Ezra could not afford to hire anyone, so my father volunteered. They worked together for 2 weeks, cutting wood-shaping paddles, fitting everything back into place. My father said it was the hardest work he ever did and the most satisfying. He paused. When the wheel started turning again, my father said. Ezra stood there and watched it for about 10 minutes without saying anything. Just watched, and then he went back inside and started grinding grain like nothing had happened. He looked at Wren. That young woman did the same thing. She fixed that wheel by herself. She got it turning again after 60 years. That takes the same kind of stubbornness my father saw in Ezra, the same kind of refusal to give up. Ruth Ann Carter went last. She was 80 years old, the oldest of the 12, and she moved slowly to the podium with a cane in each hand. I sat on that rock by the creek, she said, the flat one down by the water. I was 6 years old. My mother sent me to the mill with a sack of corn, and I sat on that rock and waited while Ezra ground it. He gave me a biscuit when he was done, made it himself on the wood stove in the corner. She was quiet for a moment, remembering. I'm 80 years old. I've eaten a lot of biscuits in my life, but I still remember how that one tasted. I remember the way the mill smelled like grain and wood smoke in the creek. I remember the sound the stones made when they turned. A low rumble you could feel in your chest. She looked at the council with eyes that were clear and sharp despite her age. I heard that sound again last month. I hiked up that trail 2 miles with these bad knees because I had to hear it for myself. And there it was. The same sound. Exactly the same. Like 60 years had not passed at all. She pointed at Wren. That girl brought something back that we thought was gone forever. She brought back the sound of our childhood, the sound of our grandparents' lives, the sound of a valley that used to know how to take care of itself. She turned to Colton Harmon. Your family tried to silence that sound 70 years ago. You are trying to silence it again now, but you will not succeed. Because that sound is not just a wheel turning. It is 150 years of history. It is 127 families who ate bread from that flour. It is everyone who ever walked up that trail with a sack of grain on their back. She paused. You cannot buy that. You cannot threaten that. You cannot make it go away just because you want to build a resort. She turned back to the council. That mill belongs to this valley. It always has. And now it belongs to that young woman because she was the one who cared enough to save it. She made her way slowly back to her seat. The room was quiet. Colton Harmon's lawyers were whispering to each other, their confident expressions gone, replaced by something that looked like uncertainty. Chairman Benson leaned forward. Miss Calloway, he said, is there anything else you would like to say? Wren stepped back to the podium. She looked at the council members at Opal, at the 12 witnesses at Colton Harmon standing rigid and silent at his podium. Mr. Harmon said, I have no family, she said. He is right. I do not. I was thrown out of my house 6 months ago. I had nowhere to go, no one to help me, nothing but $10 in my pocket. She paused. But Ezra Whitmore did not have family either. He never married. He never had children. He died alone in his chair by the fireplace, and nobody found him for 3 days. She looked at the room full of people who had come to speak for her. But he was not alone, she said. He had this valley. He had 127 families who brought him their grain and ate bread from his flour. He had neighbors who remembered him and told stories about him and passed those stories down to their children and grandchildren. She picked up the letter Ezra had written, the one she had found in the leather pouch beneath the floorboards. He wrote this letter in 1958, she said, 4 years before he died. He hid it under the floor because he knew that someday someone would find it, someone who needed it. She unfolded the paper and began to read. If you are reading this letter, you have found my mill and you have found my savings. I do not know who you are. I do not know when you are reading this, but I know this much. You came looking. You walked the trail. You pushed through the door. You climbed the stairs. You noticed the loose boards. That tells me something about you. It tells me you are the kind of person who pays attention, the kind of person who does not give up easy, the kind of person this mill needs. She looked up. Ezra Whitmore did not know me. He died 40 years before I was born, but he believed in me anyway. He believed that someday someone would come and find what he had hidden, someone who would care about the mill as much as he did, someone who would keep the stones turning and the wheel spinning and the valley fed. She set the letter down. I am that person, she said. I am 18 years old. I have no family. I have no money except what I found under the floorboards and what I have earned grinding grain. I have no lawyers, no connections, no power. She looked directly at Colton Harmon. But I have something you do not have, she said. I have the truth. I have the records. I have the letters. I have 127 families who remember what this mill meant to their ancestors. I have 12 people who took time out of their lives to come here and speak for a place they believe in. She turned back to the council. That mill has been feeding this valley for 150 years. It fed families during the Civil War. It fed families during the Depression. It fed families through floods and droughts and hard times that most of us cannot imagine. She paused. And it can keep feeding them, if you let it. She stepped back from the podium. I am asking you to let the mill stand. I am asking you to let me keep working. I am asking you to protect a piece of history that belongs to everyone in this valley, not just the people who can afford to buy it. She looked at the 12 witnesses at Opal with her walking stick at the council members behind their long table. Ezra Whitmore left me a message, she said. He wrote it 60 years ago, but he was speaking to me. He said, "Do not let them win." She looked at Colton Harmon one last time. I do not intend to. The council deliberated for 45 minutes. Wren sat on the bench next to Opal and waited. The 12 witnesses sat behind them talking quietly among themselves. Colton Harmon stood in the hallway with his lawyers, their heads bent together in urgent conversation. Wren's hands were still shaking. She pressed them flat against her knees and tried to breathe, but the air felt thick and heavy and her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Opal reached over and patted her hand. "You did good," she said. "Whatever happens now, you did good." Wren nodded. She could not speak. She was not sure she could do anything except sit and wait and try not to fall apart. At 11:45, the doors to the hearing room opened and the clerk called everyone back inside. The council members were seated behind their table. Chairman Benson was in the center, a piece of paper in front of him, his wire-rimmed glasses perched on the end of his nose. Wren walked back to her podium. Colton Harmon walked to his. They stood facing the council, waiting for the verdict. Chairman Benson cleared his throat. "This council has reviewed the evidence presented today," he said. "We have considered the testimony of the witnesses and the arguments of both parties. We have examined the records of the tax sale, the history of the property, and the claims regarding its status." He paused and looked at Wren. "Miss Calloway, the tax sale through which you acquired the Whitmore Mill property was conducted according to proper procedures. There are no grounds to challenge its validity. You are the legal owner of the property." He turned to Colton Harmon. "Mr. Harmon, your claim regarding the historic classification of the property is noted. However, this council finds that any failure to properly classify the property occurred before the tax sale and is not grounds for reversing the transfer of ownership." He looked down at the paper in front of him. "Furthermore, this council has been moved by the testimony presented today regarding the historical significance of the Whitmore Mill. The records and letters discovered on the property demonstrate that the mill served this community for over a century and remains an important part of our heritage." He looked up. "Therefore, this council hereby designates the Whitmore Mill on Laurel Creek as a Madison County historic site. This designation protects the property from demolition or substantial alteration without review by the County Historical Commission. It also establishes a protective buffer zone of 1 mile around the property within which no commercial development may occur without special approval." He set down the paper. "Miss Calloway, you may continue to operate the mill as a working grist mill subject to obtaining the proper licenses and permits which you have already begun the process of acquiring. The cease and desist order regarding commercial operations is hereby lifted." He looked at Colton Harmon. "Mr. Harmon, your complaint is dismissed. Your legal challenge to the tax sale is dismissed. This matter is closed." He picked up his gavel and brought it down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "This hearing is adjourned." For a long moment, Wren did not move. She stood at the podium, her hands gripping the wooden surface, her mind trying to process what had just happened. She had won. She had actually won. Then Opal was beside her, wrapping her arms around her, and the 12 witnesses were crowding around, patting her on the back and shaking her hand and saying things she could barely hear through the ringing in her ears. She looked across the room. Colton Harmon was standing at his podium, his face pale, his jaw tight. His lawyers were already packing up their documents, already turning toward the door, already accepting defeat. For a moment his eyes met hers. There was anger there, and frustration, and something else. Something that might have been respect grudging and unwilling, but real. Then he turned and walked out of the room without saying a word, and Wren never saw him again. 1 year later. The Whitmore mill sat in the morning light, its stone walls warm with sunshine, its water wheel turning slow and steady in the current of Laurel Creek. Wren stood on the porch and watched the valley wake up. Mist was rising from the creek, soft and white, curling through the trees like smoke. Birds were singing in the forest, a chorus of calls and responses that had been going on for millions of years before anyone built anything here. She was 19 now, a year older than she had been when she first walked up this trail with a garbage bag full of clothes and a pocket full of hope. A year older and a lifetime wiser. The mill was working, really working. She had her licenses now, her permits, her official designation as a historic site. She ground grain 3 days a week, corn and wheat and rye, producing flour that sold at 5 shops in the valley and beyond. Vernon still brought his corn, Ruth still brought her wheat, Douglas still brought his rye. And they had been joined by others farmers who had heard about the mill and wanted to be part of something that connected them to the past, something real and useful and good. Mabel sold the flour at Honey and Rye, the same bakery where Wren had swept floors at 4:30 in the morning, the same bakery where she had sat eating toast on the night she was thrown out. The flour sold out every week. People drove from Asheville and beyond to buy a bag of stone-ground meal, to take home something that had been made the way things used to be made before factories and machines and the relentless march of progress changed everything. Opal came every 2 weeks, just as she had promised. She brought honey and pickled ramps and dried apples and wool socks. She knitted herself during the long winter evenings. She sat on the porch and drank coffee and watched the wheel turn and told stories about Ezra and the valley and the way things used to be. She was 85 now. Her walking stick was a little more necessary than it had been a year ago. Her steps were a little slower, but her eyes were still sharp, and her memory was still clear, and her voice still carried the weight of 8 decades of mountain living. "I never thought I would see this place alive again," she said one afternoon, watching the wheel catch the water and turn. "I thought it was gone forever. I thought the Harmon family had won just by waiting." She looked at Wren. "But they did not win. They thought they could wait us out. But they were wrong. They did not count on you." Wren did not know what to say. She never knew what to say when Opal talked like that, when she gave her credit for something that had happened almost by accident, almost by chance, almost by the simple fact that Wren had been desperate enough to buy a $10 mill house and stubborn enough not to give up. "I didn't do anything special," she said. "I just did what needed to be done." Opal laughed, a dry sound like leaves rustling. "That is what special people always say," she said. "They think everyone would do what they did. They do not understand that most people would have given up. Most people would have taken the money. Most people would have looked at a crumbling building on a creek in the middle of nowhere and seen nothing but problems." She pointed at the mill. "You saw something else. You saw what Ezra saw. You saw a place that mattered, a place worth fighting for." She stood up, using her walking stick for support. "That is special," she said, "whether you believe it or not." She started down the trail, her rubber boots splashing in the puddles, her walking stick tapping against the stones. Same time in 2 weeks, she called over her shoulder, "I will bring more socks. You keep wearing them out." Wren watched her go until she disappeared around the bend in the trail. Then she turned and went back inside to start the day's work. That evening, when the grinding was done and the last farmer had collected his flour and gone home, Wren walked down to the flat rock by the creek. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold and purple. The creek ran past her feet cold and clear, making its endless journey down the valley to join the larger rivers that would eventually reach the sea. The water wheel creaked softly behind her, still turning even though the grinding stones were still. It would turn all night, all week, all year, as long as the creek kept flowing, which it would. The creek had been flowing since before anyone built anything here. It would keep flowing long after everyone alive today was gone. Wren thought about Ezra Whitmore, who had stood in this same place 100 years ago, watching the same sunset, listening to the same creek. He had been a young man once, taking over the mill from his father, learning the work, becoming the person the valley needed him to be. He had grown old here. He had worked here every day for 40 years. He had ground grain for 127 families, keeping them fed through good times and bad, asking nothing in return except his share of the flour. And when Warren Harmon had come with his money and his threats and his plans to tear down everything Ezra had built, he had said no. Not once, not twice, but again and again, year after year, until the word became less a refusal than a statement of identity. This is who I am. This is what I do. This is what I will not give up. Wren understood that now. She understood it in her bones, in the calluses on her hands, in the ache in her shoulders, from carrying grain and turning stones and doing the work that kept this place alive. She had come here with nothing. A garbage bag full of clothes, $10 in her pocket, a heart full of fear, and a head full of doubt. And she had found something she did not know she was looking for. Not just money, although there was that. Not just a home, although there was that too. But something deeper, something harder to name. A purpose. A reason to get up in the morning, a place where what she did mattered, where her work meant something, where she could see the results of her effort in the bags of flour she sent down the trail and the bread that people made and the meals that families shared. She had found belonging, real belonging, the kind that comes not from being born into the right family or having the right connections or looking the right way, but from showing up and doing the work and refusing to quit even when everything seemed impossible. She belonged to this mill now, and it belonged to her. The sound of the grinding stones rumbled up through the valley, low and deep, a vibration you could feel more than hear. It was the same sound Ruth Ann Carter had heard when she was 6 years old, sitting on this very rock waiting for Ezra to finish grinding her corn. The same sound that had echoed down this valley for 150 years, telling everyone within earshot that things were working the way they should. The sound of history. The sound of continuity. The sound of something that lasts. Wren sat on the flat rock and listened to it as the last light faded from the sky and the stars began to appear overhead. She thought about everything that had happened since that Thursday in February when she had come home to find a garbage bag on the porch. She thought about Mabel and the toast and the phone calls. She thought about the long walk up the trail and the first sight of the mill through the trees. She thought about the money in the mason jars and the letter in the leather pouch and the warning that had echoed across 60 years. Don't let them win. She had not let them win. She had stood in front of a county council with shaking hands and a pounding heart, and she had told the truth, and the truth had been enough. Ezra had believed in her before he ever knew she existed. He had trusted that someday someone would come, someone who would care, someone who would fight, someone who would keep the stones turning and the wheel spinning and the valley fed. She had been that someone, not because she was special, not because she was chosen, but because she was there, because she showed up, because she didn't give up. That was all any of us could do. Show up, do the work, refuse to quit. And sometimes if we were lucky, if we were stubborn enough, if we cared about something more than we cared about ourselves, We could build something that lasted, something that mattered, something that fed people. Wren Calloway had been 18 years old and thrown out of her house with a garbage bag full of clothes and $10 in her pocket. She had bought a crumbling mill house on a creek in the mountains of North Carolina, and beneath the floorboards, she had found something that changed her life forever. Not just the money, not just the letter, but a connection to a man she had never met, a community she had not known existed, a history that stretched back 150 years and forward into a future she was only beginning to imagine. She had found a place to belong. She had found a reason to exist. She had found herself. The water wheel turned behind her, slow and steady, catching the water and letting it go, doing the work it had been built to do. The stars shone overhead, the same stars that Ezra had watched, the same stars his father had watched, the same stars his grandfather had watched when he cut the first stones from the creek bed and began to build. And the creek kept flowing cold and clear and patient, carrying the sound of the grinding stones down the valley, telling everyone who could hear it that the Whitmore Mill was alive, that someone was there, that someone cared, that someone had refused to give up.